So the traditional story for Epiphany Sunday, as you can imagine, is the gift of the Magi coming to Bethlehem, seeing the star off in yonder and moving westward until they get to Bethlehem where they bring the gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And that's the story that we know so well for Epiphany and Epiphany Sunday. But for our purposes today, we're going to read one of the less traditional and yet still assigned readings for the lectionary for Epiphany. And this comes from the letter to the churches in Ephesus. Now, it's less of a letter and more of a sermon. And many scholars think that it probably wasn't written by Paul. It was probably written by someone following Paul, who took some sermons or some ideas of Paul, took the letter of Galatians, and then put a new salutation and a new ending on it and sent it to the churches in Ephesus. But really, that doesn't matter for our purposes today. I'm just telling you that so, like, if you ever find your way onto Jeopardy, you can say, like, hey, what's one of the letters that was assigned to Paul but probably wasn't written by? You say Ephesus. So what I want you to pay attention to is the idea that Paul, and I'm going to refer to him as Paul through the sermon, is living into God's plan. Since that there had been a plan by God from the very beginning and has been converted from the way that he used to see God's plan, and with a bit of courage has lived into a new way of living into God's plan. Now, the version that Rich is going to read for us comes to us from the translation or the paraphrasing of the Message, which is kind of a folky way of understanding the gospel and understanding our sacred story. But I think it really gets to the point and will help us understand what Paul, the writer, is trying to get across to us. So listen with new ears to a non-traditional reading for Epiphany Sunday, the third chapter of the letter to the churches in Ephesus. Rich?
Ephesus chapter 3, verses 1 to 13. The secret plan of God. This is why I, Paul, am in jail for Christ, having taken up the cause of you outsiders, so-called. I take it that you are familiar with the part I was given in God's plan for including everybody. I got the inside story on this from God himself, as I just wrote you in brief. As you read over what I've written to you, you are able to see for yourself into the mystery of Christ. None of our ancestors understood this. Only in our time has it been made clear by God's Spirit through the holy apostles and prophets of this new order. The mystery is that people who have never heard of God and those who have heard of him all their lives, that what has been called outsiders and insiders, stand on the same ground before God. They get the same offer, same help, same promises in Christ Jesus. The message is accessible and welcoming to everyone across the board. This is my life work, helping people understand and respond to this message. It came as a sheer gift to me, a real surprise. God handling all the details. When it came to presenting the message to people who have no background in God's way, I was the least qualified of any of the available Christians. God saw to it that I was equipped, but you can be sure that it had nothing to do with my natural abilities. So here I am, preaching and writing about things that are way over my head, the inexhaustible riches and generosity of Christ. My task is to bring out in the open and make plain what God, who created all this in the first place, has been doing in secret and behind the scenes all along. Through followers of Jesus like yourselves, gathered in churches, this extraordinary plan of God is becoming known and talked about even among the angels. All this is proceeding along lines planned all along by God and then executed in Christ Jesus. When we trust in him, we're free to say whatever needs to be said, bold to go wherever we need to go. So don't let my presence trouble on your behalf get you down. Be proud. Please join me in the congregational response to our sacred story. This is the sacred story of God and God's people. Still speaking God, speak to us today. Thank you,
God. So I'm getting into the bad habit of throwing away perfectly written and prepared sermons at the last second because of some spur of the moment kind of feel of the Holy Spirit to do something different. I did that on Christmas Eve. I had a whole different sermon planned for the 9 p.m. Christmas Eve service, but I loved what I did and what came out of me at the 5:30 Christmas Eve service that I tried to recreate it at the 9 p.m. And then if you were in church last Sunday, then you got to hear that sermon that was going to be at the 9 p.m. on Christmas Eve for the Sunday after Christmas. So they were all worked out. But I had a completely different sermon planned for this morning for Epiphany Sunday until I woke up this morning and got online at 4 a.m., which is normally the time that I wake up so that I can rehearse and revise the sermon. And I received a message on Facebook saying that my mentor, the man who, when I consider and say, this person is my pastor, the Reverend H. Edwin Middleton, the senior minister at First Community Church in Dallas, Texas, is, as of today, retired. Just like that. I had no idea that he was retiring. I had no idea that this was coming. I received a Facebook message saying that this was happening, that it was his last Sunday at First Community Church. And so I decided just to take a moment of personal privilege. And as much as this is an Epiphany sermon, I just would like to say that this sermon is in honor of Reverend H. Edwin Middleton, who I affectionately call Ed, who has been a tremendous colleague, a wonderful mentor, and a cherished friend for the last 18 years. So you may or may not know this, but Ed had a huge part of Sasha and I coming to this church over 3 years ago. So we had met with the search committee all through the weekend, had preached at Pioneer Ocean View, and we went to dinner that evening, and they presented a package for us to consider, and we received that package. Many of you were here, remember the search committee coming to the church saying, we need a package, and y'all got a package together real quick, and they met me that Sunday evening, and they presented that package. But what some people didn't know was that I had a package already on the table from another church in Oregon. And can I say, I'm consistently and constantly happy that I sensed the call of God to come to Kensington Community Church, except for, I have to say, it would be so cool to be at a church in Oregon this morning after TCU came back from 31 down at halftime to beat them in triple overtime. I would be insufferable today if I was at a church in Oregon. So after receiving the package from the search committee of Kensington Community Church, we went back to the hotel. We were thinking, we were praying, we were mulling all these two offers over, and I reached a conclusion that I was pretty sure of where we were going to go and what we were going to do, but I wanted just one more time to say it out loud and to process it one more time with my mentor, my pastor. So I called Ed. And after talking with Ed and talking to him about Kensington and talking to him about the church in Oregon, talking to him about the different packages and where my heart was and what I was sensing, Ed went, and Ed had this way, whenever he's thinking, he does that. He thinks by clicking his teeth. And he said, well, I think, Daryl, that the church in Oregon is looking for a professional minister. Someone who is going to wear a robe every Sunday and fit within their box. And I think the church in Kensington and San Diego is looking for a preacher and a pastor. He said, now I don't want to offend you, but you're a horrible professional minister. He said, if you go to that church in Oregon, probably within 3 years' time, they're going to run you out. and you're going to be miserable. But I think you got a chance to do something pretty special with the people down in San Diego, because you're a pretty good preacher and pastor. And I think that's what they're looking for. And so I hung up the phone, talked it over with Sasha, called up Jackie Trishman, immediately accepted the offer, and then made a pretty tough but quick call to the people in Oregon and told them that we weren't coming. And so if it wasn't for Ed and that opportunity to orally just process what I was feeling and the call that I was sensing and where I felt the Spirit was guiding, we might not have ended up here. And so Ed had a huge part in bringing me here, which is really to say that he's had a huge part in the midst of my ministry from the very beginning. Like Paul says, it's not because of natural ability and capabilities that I am a minister in any way, shape, or form. In many ways, I was shaped and molded by Ed. And if any of you have a colleague or a mentor who you trust implicitly that you can go to and lean on and process with, you know the value of a good mentor and what they can do to bring the very best out of you and to calm your nerves and to point you in a direction. And Ed has always been that for me. And so on this day in which he is just like that decided to retire, I just thought of all the ways that he had lived so boldly, as the writer of Ephesians says, to say what needs to be said and to go where needs to be gone. He has, in his whole life and ministry, lived in that way. He began as the grandson of the minister of a Southern Baptist church in a small town in the Smoky Mountains in North Carolina. His father then was the next minister of that small church, Southern Baptist church, in a small town in the Smoky Mountains of North Carolina. And yet Ed could not, in any way, shape, or form, find himself preaching and ministering in that tradition, particularly when it came to the way that the Southern Baptist church dealt or was misogynistic towards women, and the way that they manipulated the gospel to say that African American people were less than. And so Ed took the courage and was bold enough to say that he had to step away from the tradition where his grandfather and his father had been the minister of this small church in the Smoky Mountains of North Carolina, where his grandmother had played piano and taught Sunday school, and his mother then came after her to teach Sunday school and play piano. And what courage does it take to sense a call from God, to hear the gospel message, to let the Epiphany light shine in your life, and to allow you to take a bold step in a new direction, throwing away family tradition. He went to Wake Forest Divinity School, and after graduating, went down to the panhandle of Florida, where he pastored a small little church. And it was just a wonderful little church where he learned how to be a pastor and how to preach and to be a minister to the people in their time. And after 4 or 5 years there, he and his wife moved up to Delaware. Where they pastored a church that started at about 35 people, and after 12 years had grown through their collaborative efforts to about 400 people. And it was such a wonderful call that at one point, over a glass of wine, Ed and the moderator of the church, about 9 years into that call, over a glass of wine, they said to each other, "You know what we need? We need a good crisis. Like, things are just so easy around here, and everyone's just kind of complacent that we kind of need just a church crisis to shake things up and to see where God is guiding us, because things just are incredibly easy." I can't imagine it being so easy that you would have to wish and pray for a crisis, but that's where they had gotten to. But just like that, one day Ed said, "My call here is done." And he picked up and he moved his family to Cincinnati, Ohio. where he took a large congregation that was a German ENR, Evangelical Reformed Church in the United Church of Christ tradition. And when I was ordained, and I was seeking my very first congregation, and I was asking Ed, like, where should I go? What should I do? How should I proceed? Ed really just had one word of advice for me. Never pastor a large German ENR church in Cincinnati. That's as well as that went, and it only lasted 2.5 years. And it was crisis after crisis after crisis after crisis. And so he resigned from this large, what's considered a large congregation, bucked the system again, had the courage, and was bold enough to step out again in faith and move his family to Dallas, Texas, where he pastored a much smaller church of about 70 to 80 people. And he started to guide them through an open and affirming process and to reducing the budget deficit and recognizing that the facility no longer fit their ministry needs and the mission of that congregation. He got them to see who they used to be so that they could discern where God was pointing them in the future. And he started to open up the ministry opportunities to ridiculously inept young men who had no idea what it meant to be a minister or a pastor, but somehow, some way had heard the call from God. And he protected me from every single mistake that the lay people of the church wanted to yell at me about. He would protect me and use them as growing edges and educational moments so that I could grow into who God was calling me to be. How many of you have a mentor like that? How many of you have a trusted friend that you can call or text or email out of the blue, even though you haven't spoken with him or her for 4 or 5, 6 months? And if you have one of them, then you know what a precious gift, more precious than gold and frankincense and myrrh they are. And I would invite you to take an opportunity to thank God for them right now. But like Paul and the Magi 30 years before the death of Christ, Paul 30 years after the death of Christ, Ed had this way of seeing God's plan in the world. And he had this way of explaining God's plan, which I know that you've seen or heard me explain it in many ways as well, that God's plan is so immense and God's love is so immaculate. It's almost impossible for the human brain and heart to fathom and to recollect. And yet, because of the grind of the everyday, because of the fog that seems to always come over us, we have such a hard time of seeing and connecting with the plan or the grace or the love of God on a day-to-day basis. But every once in a while, by the grace of God, the fog lifts and the grind stops, and this really neat path starts to unfold in front of us, and the fog parts, and we can see so clearly the grace and the love and the compassion of God. And it gives us peace and courage so that we can say what needs to be said and go where we need to go. When we connect with the infinite in a very human way, Ed liked to call those moments of grace. And if you are lucky, you get to experience a moment of grace each and every day. But if we're honest with ourselves, it doesn't happen every single day. It's hard because of the fog and the grind and the everyday. So when we do experience a moment of grace, we hold on to them. We collect them. And we hope to string enough moments of grace together so that we can truly see the fruits of the kingdom come on earth as they is in heaven. And the way that we normally, or are most likely to experience a moment of grace, is when we perform acts of kindness for others, and when others perform acts of kindness for us. And so, as Paul said, the gospel message is open to everyone. It doesn't matter if you're male or female. You can be kind. It doesn't matter if you're young or old. You can have a heart of compassion. It doesn't matter if you're gay or straight. You can be a peaceful presence in the midst of chaos. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. You can provide a space for all in this community. It doesn't matter who we are. We all have access to God's grace, and we can all experience it in our own time and place. And it usually happens when we are kind. So Ed liked to end sermons with questions. I used to do that. I think probably the first, so there's 52 weeks in the year, plus Maundy, Thursday, 2 on Christmas Eve. So probably for the first 150 or so sermons of my career, I probably ended my sermons with questions too. But in honor of my mentor, my friend, and my colleague, I'd like to end the sermon today with a question. Where do you experience moments of grace in your life? When's the last time you've had a moment of grace? Where can you be kind to others? Where in your life can you make yourself accessible to receive the kindness of someone else? Where do you need to speak boldly? Go boldly. And how is it that we can string those moments of grace together here in this community so that we can bear witness to the fruits of the kingdom coming on earth as they are in heaven? Well,